Silver Silverman Show.
Well, we just finished a fun series on Christianity and faith and religion and big questions that people ask in church. So I thought it would be a fun follow up to do an episode on science and faith and big questions that people have about science and Christianity together. So we've gotten a few questions together that people have asked and perspectives people want to hear about. So let's dive into it.
So, one of the common misconceptions in our society, I think, Matt, is that science and faith are incompatible, or at least somewhat incompatible. You have a diverse array of, I think, opinions on this topic. What's your take on this? Are science and faith incompatible?
No, science is fundamentally, at its core, understanding what the laws of the universe are. It's using the scientific method of constructing tests to determine what the laws that govern the universe are. Religion is about how we relate to God and understanding who God is and what God calls us to do. They address fundamentally different questions, but there's nothing about them that's inherently incompatible. Um, uh, Science and faith are asking two fundamentally different questions. Faith is why are we here? What's our purpose? And science is how do we accomplish tasks? How does the universe work? What are the mechanisms involved? You know, if I drop a pen from a certain height up, how many seconds is it going to take for it to hit the floor? So these are fundamentally different questions that science and faith ask.
So, on what basis do you think, people today in modern society claim that science and faith are incompatible? Like, what are the traps we should be looking for?
I think it this divide really happened when Darwinian evolution became popular.
Okay.
Before that, it wasn't really an issue. If you go back to the scientists of old, science was seen as a fundamentally religious pursuit. You go back, like there was, I actually printed out a list here of old scientists just because there were so many to look into. Pope Sylvester II was actually called the Math Pope, and he did so much in math that he was actually at one point accused of sorcery. It was a really hilarious act, more political than anything else. The guy tried to accuse him of sorcery because of how how excellent he was in his mathematical predictions and
Sounds
stuff.
like a compliment.
And so they actually had a whole trial, and the guy, he wasn't the pope at the time, he became pope later, and he completely humiliated the guy who was bringing the accusations because it was it's obviously it wasn't sorcery, it was math.
So he was a man of faith.
Yeah, he was a man of faith, but he was also a man of science.
Huh.
You go to I think also people like Copernicus and Galileo. People like to look at those conflicts between astronomers and the church at the time to cite those. Copernicus worked in a cathedral in a position that was normally reserved for priests.
Oh, wow.
So and he was even though there was controversy and criticism over his work. His stuff was never really banned. It was never officially banned. He was actually urged to publish by the Catholic bishop. What's his name? Guys, and a cardinal as well as a pope. He was encouraged to publish his stuff.
Publish his Christian stuff or his scientific?
His scientific, his astronomy stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Kepler taught at Kepler also in astronomy. He taught at a seminary.
Oh, wow.
He was a Protestant.
Kepler.
He was a Protestant who wanted to be a minister. Galileo was actually good friends with the Pope. The Pope actually commissioned him to write his dialogue. And what he was writing was a dialogue between two people with opposing views on whether the Earth was the center of the solar system or whether the sun was.
Oh.
And that was the debate of the time. And the issue was, and so the Pope held the view that the Earth was the center, and Galileo held the view that the sun was the center.
Right.
But the Pope asked him, look, I understand this is a controversial issue. It's an important issue. And he trusted Galileo to write an unbiased view of these two views.
So Galileo was a Christian?
Yeah, Galileo was a Christian.
Wow, they don't teach you that one in school.
And so this dialogue he wrote was two people debating the idea. And the problem was that the name that he gave to the guy who was defending the Pope's view he was named it after a Greek, I believe it was a Greek philosopher named Simplicitus. And I think it was Simplicitus or something like that. And some people accused him of using that name to say that the Pope was simple-minded. Oh. And that's where that was actually where the controversy came from. So it wasn't actually that he wrote the thing, but rather that people accused him of insulting the Pope when he did write it, and that triggered their falling out. You look at someone like Francis Bacon, who's considered the father of empiricism, and he had very harsh things to say about atheists, to the point where he thought that it was impossible to do science as an atheist, because to be a scientist, you had to have faith that the universe was obeying constant, unchanging laws. Wow. And an atheist had no reason to believe such a thing. Like, you had to believe that the universe had a lawgiver in order to hold the view that the universe had unchanging laws. You look at the father of genetics is Gregory Mandel. Right?
This takes me back to bio.
Mendelian genetics, right? In the Punnett squares, we probably all learned in high school.
Right.
He's the father of genetics. He was an abbot at an abbey.
Oh, wow.
So,
this is so fascinating.
Yeah. So
they don't teach you this piece.
Yeah. So all of the great scientists, even Isaac Newton, he wrote more theology than he wrote on physics. Even we consider him the father of modern physics. Now, a lot of his theology was wrong.
Really?
Well, he was, it was funny. He was arguing against the existence of the Trinity.
Interesting.
But he was doing it because the main defense of the Trinity at his time, was based on a verse that wasn't in the original text. So he's actually a textual critic. He was analyzing early versions of the Bible. He's saying the verse that you're citing, it's a verse from 1 John that usually isn't included in our modern day Bibles. That was used as a defense of the Trinity. He's like, hey, this verse isn't in early manuscripts. So he's actually a textual critic. Of the Bible.
On the right track, but...
Yeah, on the right track. All of these old scientists, they considered science an expression, their study of science as an expression of their faith.
Wow. So this idea in and of itself is revolutionary, I think, in modern society. Like, people don't know this. Like, when did that shift happen?
Yeah, it was really with Darwinian evolution, where all of a sudden someone came up with this idea that humans were not divinely created, but rather that started proposing the idea that all humans came about by random chance, and we're no different than any other species. There's nothing particularly supernatural about creation, and that the whole universe arose through natural means.
Right.
So that's really when the divide started, and there was a pushback against this new idea. The Christians were pushing back against this idea that humans are no different than any other animal.
Right.
And atheists were clinging to this idea of, now finally we've got a reason to believe that we came into existence that doesn't require the supernatural.
Right.
So that's, I think, when the divide started, and that's really only in the last century or so.
Wow, this is so fascinating. Well, let's just take a quick segue there, just because you brought it up. Let's talk about evolution for a minute, because, for those of us who, haven't been trained as scientists, or what have you, why shouldn't we embrace the, quote, theory of evolution? I mean, there are a lot of other scientific theories or laws or what have you. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the correct lingo is. But, there are a lot of other theories that we as Christians embrace, the theory of relativity or what have you. What is it about the theory of evolution that's so flawed or wrong that we as Christians, other than the fact that it conflicts with our faith, that we as Christians can't look to it as actual evidence?
So there's a few different things that someone might mean when they're talking about evolution, and that's where some of the confusion arises.
Okay.
So there's some evolution that I would say is not a theory, it's an observation. And that is mutations develop in genomes, and you develop this variation among species, and the species that have attributes that are more profitable for survival, that make it more easy for them to reproduce and pass on and have offspring. Those are the ones that tend to survive.
Is this the natural selection?
Yeah, natural
piece?
selection.
Okay.
The natural selection
That's what
piece.
okay.
Right. That's not necessarily theory as much as an observation. Like in my master's research that I did at UCLA, I used directed evolution experiments to evolve bacteria, basically, produce increased levels of methionine.
So that piece is true.
Yeah,
so
that we can observe it.
It's
it's not a theory. You can actually observe mutations developing, and I created this selective pressure where the bacteria that were produced more methionine, which is an amino acid, would grow faster, and I was able to select for those particular strains of bacteria.
Got it. Okay.
And so you can see that, and you can see it more in species that reproduce more rapidly. So like insects and bacteria that reproduce new generations very quickly. You can see this effect more than in other species.
Okay.
So the problem is that's a fundamentally different claim than the claim that all life arose from a single cell organism that existed 1 billion years ago or something like that.
Okay.
So the idea that it's possible for first of all, for a single cell organism to arise into existence out of nothing, without any prior anything living before that, for something to actually come into existence at all is
is that what they claim?
Yeah,
is
yeah,
that is that the
there's
theory in a nutshell? I mean,
yeah, that we all that out of nowhere, a single cell organism came into existence and then started self-replicating and developing mutations, and then from that all life emerged, is basically the concept.
I see.
And so every species that we have some common ancestor that goes back over the course of 1 billion years or so. So humans and all primates, humans, monkeys, gorillas, we had some common ancestor that existed. And then humans and elephants, we had some common ancestor that existed before that. And you have new species that develop. The problem is there's limitations on how much variation you can actually generate through this process. Evolutionary biologists will just take it for granted that you have unlimited ability to generate mutations and changes such that you can develop entire new species. The problem is once you change so much, you're no longer able to reproduce with the old species. You're no longer, like, for instance, can you
give an example on this?
Like, for instance, a horse and a donkey.
Okay.
You mate them together, you get a mule, right?
Okay.
A mule cannot reproduce.
Okay.
So you have two different species that while they can mate together, their offspring is not fertile. Their offspring can't reproduce.
Right.
And so evolution tends to run into problems where they just assume you can do anything. It's like this black box that anything can come out. But we can see that in real life there are limitations. Like you can only change something so much before it no longer can reproduce. Basically genetic diseases that we think of today. Right. If you have a mutation, it tends to make things work worse, not better. And so this idea that you can just generate mutations endlessly to create new species, there are limitations that I think evolutionary biology
doesn't account for.
Yeah, that they don't like to acknowledge. I think it's also important that there's no good model for where this original bacteria or where this original single cell organism came from.
Oh, really?
I've seen all kinds of models all over the place and the reason there's so many different models for how life originated is all of them have fundamental flaws. Like they all have some problem. Like I remember looking at one model that someone was proposing that required that the sun replace the Earth's atmosphere 3 times over with a solar flare. Like a solar flare comes and completely changes the Earth's atmosphere to allow for the next stage in development such that life could emerge. So you have to have
crazy assumptions.
Crazy assumptions and things that are so drastic that they're really incompatible with logical thinking when it really boils down to it. I mean, actually, the first lab that I was working in when I was doing my PhD, the professor would outright say, that the idea that you can generate even one new protein through random mutation. You put a bacteria out on the beach, expose it to UV light, and let it randomly accumulate mutations. It's absurd to think that you can generate. You could wait 1 billion years. You're not going to get a single new protein. Right? So he wasn't religious. He wasn't a Christian. He had no theological axe to grind. He was just, as a scientist, being honest. He's like, there's no way that this can happen.
So just playing devil's advocate, I mean, has this rebuttal to evolution been addressed in the literature or by the scientific community? Like how?
No, because I think it's a...
Is it an echo chamber? Like
I think it's an echo chamber.
But let's be fair. I mean, have they considered this?
I don't think so. I think because now religious thought and scientific thought have diverted so drastically that evolution has just become the paradigm among scientists.
It's just accepted.
It's just accepted and taken for granted. And you're really not allowed to criticize it. You're not allowed to say, there are still problems that we haven't addressed.
Wow.
Because they're so taken by this idea that life had to emerge through natural means.
Wow. I mean, do you know that when this theory was originally, developed or conceived, if there was a pushback, were there journals written by the scientific community on the other side?
Even Darwin admitted that if you could find a species that couldn't have possibly emerged through a series of small, simple steps, then his whole theory would break down. And his problem was at the time they didn't understand molecular biology. They didn't understand proteins, DNA, things at the molecular level. And I think if he had understood that, he wouldn't have given his theory the credibility that he had given it. Because he was thinking about small changes like the size of a bird's beak.
Microevolution, right? Is that what we call microevolution versus macro?
Yeah, natural selection. The idea that you have birds with different size beaks or giraffes with different lengths of their necks.
That's logical.
He wasn't imagining this molecular world where there's proteins in DNA and you have to have drastic changes in DNA to produce entirely new functions in biology.
So who came up with this? Sorry, I'm obviously uninformed on that. Who came up with the specific theory of evolution as it applies to this, original?
It would have been Darwin. Darwin came up with the idea that new species could arise through this process of natural selection.
And then scientists later, in other words, hooked onto it to create this extrapolation.
Yeah,
with
or
the
specifically
atheists.
Specifically atheists jumped on board with this. And then at some point, it became unchristian to work in the scientific field, and it became unscientific to be in the Christian. And so these domains started to separate.
I see. So is that a thing now in the scientific community that Christians are kind of, you kind of keep it in the closet?
Not as much as people want to think. Like, I think in biology you're less likely to find Christians, but in the realm of physics you're much more likely.
Talk about that. Why is that?
Because I think, as particularly young physicists, realize you can't have a universe that comes out of nothing. I think one of the questions that we got was,
why not?
Yeah, did God use science to create the world or the universe?
Oh,
right?
yeah, that was a good question.
And it's a good question, but I think the question is actually fundamentally, could the universe or could the world have arisen through natural means? Okay. And I think physicists realized you can't, because you can't have something that comes out of nothing. Because all physicists realize that the universe has a finite lifespan, and that's because of the laws of thermodynamics.
Okay, and that's over my pay grade.
Well, not as much as you think. Like, these are the laws. Yeah, these are the laws that go into how a refrigerator works.
Okay.
So these are fundamental scientific laws of thermodynamics that processes progress towards more disorder, not more order.
Okay.
So the universe is slowly progressing into more disorder.
Okay.
And thus has a finite lifespan. We call eventually the universe is going to decay into what we call the heat death, where nothing can happen anymore because everything is all...
That sounds scary, guys.
Well, yeah,
Let's
they call
hope
it
we're not close.
the heat death of the universe. No, it's something that would be trillions of years away, but at the end of the day, the universe has a finite lifespan and it had a beginning. Okay. And physicists know that you can't have a beginning of the universe without breaking our current laws of physics. You have to have some supernatural event.
This is key.
Yeah, that our current laws of physics can't account for.
Can you just explain that one more time? Because
I think the best explanation of it goes to actually a quote from Isaac Newton.
Okay.
When he developed his theory of gravity that defined the motions of the planets, one of his things that he wanted to emphasize when he published his stuff is, yes, these mathematical models determine how the universe works, how the planets move, but someone still had to set the planets in motion. And that's something that physicists understand, that someone had to set this stuff in motion. That idea still applies today. And without some supernatural event setting these things in motion, nothing would be happening. And that's something biologists don't think about. They think about things once life is already created, this is what's going on.
Well, they don't ever address the question of, well, I guess they have evolution to address how life started.
Yeah, but they don't ever really address how life started. They kind of leave it as some black box of, well, life had to have started because we exist.
Okay, question. Can we pivot to, I just had a thought about the Big Bang Theory.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that for the non-scientists in the room, and how does that relate to all this?
Yeah, so it's the idea that the universe originated from a single point, some single event that violates the laws of physics, such that the universe exploded out of that point.
Okay.
So it's a point of incredible energy.
Oh, so this is what the atheist physicists believe?
Yeah. Even an atheist physicist will say the universe started at an original point and that it exploded out of that point.
Okay.
What's interesting is also in the Big Bang Theory is the idea that the universe is expanding. And when they say the universe is expanding, they don't mean stuff is moving away, like stuff is traveling through space away from this original point of explosion. They mean actual space is expanding. Like actual,
that blows my mind.
Yeah, it blows everyone's mind. It's not something that people think about.
Okay.
But it also makes you wonder, like, are the laws of science, all the fundamental laws of the universe even constant if space itself is not a constant? It's a fascinating. That's beyond the scope of what we could talk about here. But yeah, the Big Bang Theory is just the universe originated at a single point in a single explosion, kind of like in the beginning God created light. Yeah, right. In the beginning, God created, and there was this creation event.
This is a good transition to how does God himself relate to science? In other words, did God, in some sense, create science? I mean, to put it dumbly, for us to discover? Or can you massage that?
Yeah,
or explain
I
that?
think you have to say God created the fundamental laws that govern the universe.
Okay.
And science is the practice of determining what those laws are.
Mm-hmm.
So science is all about what are the laws that govern the universe. And you could say God created those laws. God is the unchanging constant.
Okay.
And he created these constant laws the law of gravity, the laws of electromagnetism, all of this stuff God created.
I see. Okay, let's try to take a different angle on this science and faith question. I just had a random thought. So, let's focus on faith now. Is faith compatible with science and reason? In other words, can we have a science-based or reason-based faith? Like, what is faith? Maybe that's a better way of...
Yeah.
What is faith and how does it relate to science?
I think people have in modern times, I think, have a warped view of faith. It's like the Miracle on 34th Street version of faith, where faith is believing when common sense tells you not to. That's a line from the Miracle on 34th movie. And I think that's what a lot of people think faith is. You have no reason to believe it, but you believe it anyway. And that's not really the kind of faith that the Bible talks about. The Bible talks about you have faith for a reason. There's a reason why we believe Jesus died for our sins, and that's because he rose again. And the apostles saw him, in the flesh.
After he had
he'd resurrected. So when they're talking about faith, they're not saying we believe Jesus rose from the dead with no evidence, right? Because they actually saw it. They saw him raised from the dead. When they're talking about faith, they're saying we believe Jesus' death did this. It paid the price for our sins, and the reason we believe it is because he rose from the dead in the way that he said he would.
Right.
So faith is believing something. It was something that we haven't seen yet, but we're believing it for a reason. It's you sit down in a chair with the faith that chair is going to hold you up because you've sat down in that chair before. So you have
okay, but I personally haven't met this Jesus dude. I mean, how can I trust, 2,000 years ago, some dude named Paul,
Right. So then you look at the evidence that we ask is, are the accounts in the Bible reliable? And then we go into, all right, is there reason to believe that the authors were reliable? And we can look at their lives, right? And we have independent records of their lives. We have non-biblical historians that are writing about early Christians. So we can look at evidence like that and say, all right, there's evidence that these Bible authors were reliable because of X, Y, and Z. They had no reason to, like for instance, they had no reason to invent these stories because they were persecuted for these stories, right? They had no reason to completely change their lives because their lives were looking like this beforehand, right? Paul was an up-and-coming guy in the group of the Pharisees before he became a Christian. He had no reason to change career paths.
Can you explain what a Pharisee is for people who aren't familiar with the Bible?
It's an old Jewish religious sect.
So he was a rabbi.
Yeah, kind of like a rabbi.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a very holy Jewish scholar, and he was someone that was high-ranking in this sect of the Jewish population.
And in fact, he persecuted Christians.
Yeah,
right?
he was persecuted. So he had no reason to change faith, right? So it's reasons like that you look at their lives and say you have no reason. There was no reason for them to do these things unless the events that they saw actually were true. And so we put our faith in stuff like that for those types of reasons. Science is one method of determining truth, and it's the method of developing experiments and tests to determine, like I keep dropping the pen at certain heights and timing how long it takes to hit the ground, and from that determine the mathematical relationship of how fast it's going and how that relates to gravity and all that stuff, right? That's what science is. We are determining these laws because we have this fundamental faith that the universe consists of unchanging physical laws.
Right.
And that itself is a statement of faith. We believe it because we have seen these unchanging laws in the past, because we drop that pen from the same height over and over again, and it keeps happening time and time again.
Okay, but isn't that different from, there was this guy that existed and we have some historical records. We can't reproduce that over and over again. If someone disagrees with the manuscript that, Paul even existed,
right.
How are they to trust it?
Well, then you can't examine any history from a scientific perspective. That's why we're not examining history through a scientific lens. We're examining history through a historical lens, and that's a different fundamental thing. That would be like forensics or something like that, right? So science is about determining what are the current laws that govern the universe.
Right.
History is about determining what are the events that happened in the past. And those are two fundamentally different questions that they're answering, two fundamentally different methods of exploring truth. And it's not that one is superior to the other. It's that one is asking and answering fundamentally different
So it's not like you're going to say, I can use the scientific method to prove as a Christian that Jesus existed.
Right.
That's not a thing.
You can't kill a Jewish carpenter and throw him in a tomb and wait 3 days to see if he rises from the dead to reproduce whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. It doesn't work that way, right?
Okay, so then let's pivot to history then on that score, because a question that arises is, all right, well, if we can assess, Jesus's, historicity through, looking at historical records, what is the status of historians looking at Jesus's character and life? Like, what is the consensus or lack thereof among historians on whether Jesus was a person and whether he resurrected?
Yeah, so even the most atheist historian will admit a few fundamental things. And you can look at atheist historians like Bart Ehrman, who's an atheist, Bible scholar.
Okay.
The most atheist historians will agree that Jesus was considered a rabbi. He was born a carpenter's son.
Okay.
He was considered a Jewish rabbi. He went around teaching. He was considered a miracle worker by his followers and by the general community. He was crucified.
They go this far.
Oh yeah, that he was crucified, that he was buried, and that within months of his death, his disciples were going around claiming that
preaching a renewed religion.
Yeah, preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Wow. Okay.
Even the most atheist historian will agree to all those points.
Okay, all right, that's a starting point.
Yeah.
So where's the split?
So they won't believe that he rose from the dead.
Right.
They won't believe that he was actually working miracles. They will believe that people thought he was doing miracles, but they won't believe that miracles are actually possible.
Okay, so obvious. So have they to your knowledge, has the average academic historian at UC Berkeley or wherever, have they looked at the historical records about the disciples' lives and all the stuff you claimed 10 minutes ago,
Mm-hmm.
That proves the historicity of Jesus? Have they have these academics looked at this stuff? I
Oh
mean,
yeah, and they'll
how
come
do
up
they?
with different explanations. So the apostles were hallucinating, or
Oh,
they
interesting.
or stuff like there's no
Have
real.
are there articles on this that I could read, or I mean,
No one really
like
publishes on it because they're just
it's just the untouchable issue? Like
yeah, it's
they.
what there's no they don't consider any reason to publish on this type of stuff.
Oh,
It's not
it's
particular.
not
It's not interesting.
sexy.
Yeah,
It's not.
it's not interesting for them. So they'll agree to these points, but it's not like an atheist will put out a significant publication about
Oh
alternative
wow.
theories to Jesus or something like that.
Oh wow.
It's
I mean, you would think this would be. I mean, aren't there like religious studies? I mean, I know at Cal there were. I mean, aren't
well
these
because
departments interested in the truth, or actually that's a
well
whole
they'll be
other
more
matter.
interested in they'll be more interested in Roman emperors or Roman Caesars, right? Than
Oh,
this
then some random guy.
yeah.
Yeah, but he started like the world religion.
Yeah,
Like,
you
I mean,
would think it would
you
be
would think.
interesting, but no, atheists don't talk about him a whole lot. I think because it's hard to get around the miracle thing.
Well, do they address that at all? Do you know in literature, or it's
I
kind
mean,
of
there
like
were lots. They'll just say there were lots of other supposed miracle workers at the time. So, yeah, they won't address whether or not any of them were actually really performing miracles. They'll just say, yeah, these guys were supposedly miracle workers. The end.
Wow. How interesting. Okay, let's pivot to sort of a totally different topic. Young Earth versus New Earth. Now you have to educate me because I just have not really thought about this issue at all, frankly. And I know that Christians are sort of divided on this. So what is this topic in a nutshell, and where do you stand on it?
Yeah. Young Earth versus old Earth, I think, is or naturally created Earth. I think my PhD time actually turned me into more of a young Earth kind of guy.
What are they? Can you just dump
so
out
young
the
Earth
basic,
is
what is this even?
young
about?
Earth is the idea that the Earth was created supernaturally. It's only I think if you do the math in terms of the existence of the generations, humans only arose. Adam and Eve were created little less than 7,000 years ago or something like that.
Okay.
I think if you actually do the math calculating how long each person lived and when they had kids and stuff like that.
Okay.
Assuming that no one is there aren't any generations or individuals that are left out in the progression, that humans arose only about 7,000 years ago. It doesn't really necessarily speak to how long before that the Earth was created. Like the Earth could have been created, a billion years before God actually started working on these days of creation. But the idea that young Earth is the idea that the Earth was created supernaturally,
Okay.
and that humans only that the sixth day of creation was only about 6,000 and something 7,000 years ago.
Okay.
Old Earth is the idea that the Earth was created 4 billion years ago in a large solar system creating event.
Like the Big Bang?
Yeah. Well, no, this
Or-
would have been long after the Big Bang. The Big Bang would have been like 14 billion years ago.
Oh, God.
And
Okay.
the Earth would have been created like 4 billion years ago.
Okay.
And for the first 3 billion years of its existence, it was just molten rock, molten lava. And then eventually the outer crust cooled to the point where water could condense and life could eventually somehow emerge through processes that we don't understand and haven't fully
Okay.
So that's the old Earth. The old Earth idea is the Earth was created entirely through natural means at the same time that the rest of the solar system was created. And young Earth is that Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day of creation about 7,000 years ago. What's interesting is when you're thinking about the young Earth idea, you have to also address the idea of what are these days of creation? Because 3 of these days of creation happen before there's even a sun, moon, and stars.
Okay,
Right,
can you explain for any people not familiar with the Bible what these days of creation are? I mean,
Yeah, so
in a
there's-
nutshell, Genesis 1.
Yeah, so Genesis 1, there's 6 days of creation, and they're presented as 2 sets of 3.
That's the first book of the Bible.
Yeah, the first book of the Bible. And what's interesting is these sets of 3 each address a different aspect of the unformed Earth. In the beginning, there was darkness.
Okay.
The Earth was unformed and it was empty. Right?
Okay.
These are 3 attributes that are given to us
Right.
about the Earth.
Okay.
Days 1 and 4 have to do with the darkness. Because on day 1, God created light
Mm-hmm.
and separated it from the darkness.
Mhm.
And on day 4, God created the sources of light, the sun,
Okay.
moon, and stars. It is very interesting.
Yeah.
On day 2, God addresses the form. So on day 2, God separates the sky and the sea.
Okay.
And then on day 5, he creates fish and birds.
Okay.
Then on day 3, God creates land and plants.
Mm-hmm.
On day 6, God creates the animals that dwell on the land.
Okay.
And that addresses the earth is empty.
I see.
So
Yeah, interesting
day
parallelism.
one and day 4 addresses the earth is dark.
Right.
Days 2 and 5 address the earth is formless, and day 3 and 6 God addresses the earth is empty.
Okay.
And so there's this very poetic imagery that goes into this. And so it's a question of, well, what does a day mean to God, particularly when 3 of those days happen when there's no sun, moon, and stars.
Okay.
Right. So that's the young Earth view. I think a young Earth person can still say that Adam and Eve were created 7,000 years ago, but the Earth could have been created billions of years before that. Like there's no point of reference between when God created the heavens and the earth and when these days of creation started. We're not given any reference point between those two in the verses in Genesis, at least.
So where do most Christians lie on this?
Oh, they're all over the place.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Do you think the
in my early days of Christianity, I was fine with just saying, oh, the Genesis account is probably just a metaphor, and we don't necessarily have to take it literally. It wasn't until grad school where I saw just how flawed a lot of the science that goes behind the creation of the earth is and the origin of life is, that I'm like, these ideas just have so little basis and good evidence that I think I'd rather just go with the Bible in terms of the creation of humankind.
This is important. So can you explain why you moved to the young earth, side? In other words, like, what are those assumptions behind the scientific models that made you say,
It's problems like,
was
in
it
order
carbon
to
dating or what was...
I mean, yeah, there's problems in the assumptions that go behind how you date how old things are, certainly. And I don't think we really have time to go into the math of how that all works. But I think fundamentally it's the issues that I brought up. Like, it's not easy to create new proteins out of nothing. It's not easy to create DNA out of nothing. And we don't have any good models for how that happened. And I think fundamentally the question you have to ask is, how do you determine the difference between what a universe would look like that was supernaturally created versus a universe that arose through natural means? Or to put it more precisely, what does an Earth look like that was created supernaturally, and how is that different than an Earth that was created through natural means? And if you can't really answer that question, you can't really determine how whether or not the universe. It's not a scientific question. If you can't say this is the difference between what those two worlds would look like, then you can't really address the science of this is why we know the universe is 14 billion years old versus a billion years old versus whatever. You can't say why the God couldn't have created a universe that just looks like it was 14 billion years ago, but really it was only created a billion years ago, or it was only created 10,000 years ago. Like, how would you tell the difference?
Yeah, I mean, Okay, interesting. So, okay. Let's end, this segment. I think we've gone a while. I think it's time to let people rest, and us. Let's end this on, there's this idea out there, because we're talking about science, that objective truth is kind of not a thing anymore, at least from what I see in society today. There's, in universities and contemporary society, postmodern thought, there's this idea that everything is relative, whether it's morals or what have you. Doesn't science, I was just thinking about this the other day, doesn't science flatly refute that idea? I mean, in other words, like, science is the idea that there are objective truths out there that we're trying to find out about.
Yeah, and that's why all of the atheists that were so dominant in the last 20 years, and people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, like these very prominent atheists, scientists and atheist thinkers, they've all been left behind by the postmodern movement.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You mean Dawkins has been sorry.
Yeah, the postmodern movement of truth is relative and there's no such thing as objective truth. Yeah, the major atheists that created this generation.
No honor among well, actually, I don't want to say that.
But basically they created a generation without God. And when you don't have God, you have no basis for objective truth. And we're seeing that play out in our society, where when there is no God, there is no objective truth. And when there's no objective truth, you can't do good science. So yeah, science is being left behind in the movement, and that's why I think you have all these unscientific ideas emerging now. Like
Oh,
you can
good
be
transit. Yeah.
right. Well, that the idea that you can be a man's brain trapped in a woman's body, right?
It's sad. Yeah.
But gender is at the same time gender is a social construct, right? And those are which are completely
Exactly.
incompatible.
Incompatible.
Yeah, those are incompatible positions. And so I think that's why, yeah, science is getting left behind by the postmodern movement, and generally all these
Huh.
atheists that
Wow.
used to be so prominent back when I was in college now are not considered prominent anymore. They're getting left behind.
Wow, this is really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Dr. Matt Silverman. It's always great to chat with you because we're married. But other than that, thanks for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Silver Silverman Show.